Hi, I'm Ray Dalio, an old friend of the Greenwich Economic Forum. In fact, probably before it was even formed, the idea of it, I was able to be a participant in. So I have a deep affection and respect for it. And I really would have loved to be there in Hong Kong with you because that's right at the edge of the important American-Chinese relations and what's going on, and it also is near the other ASEAN countries, which is a very hot place to be. So in any case, I can't make it, and I will jump into some of my thoughts. In history, in my history of playing markets for 50 years or so, some of the times that I was surprised because the things that happened never happened in my lifetime. And when I studied history, I found they happened many times in history. So I studied the Great Depression, 1930 to 45 period, and I, because of that, had a systematic way of dealing with the economy when we got into depression-type situations, bad situations that helped us a lot in the 2008 financial crisis. And so three important developments are happening now that prompted me to do the study, which led to the book that I wrote, which is Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Those three things are an enormous amount of debt creation and the monetization of debt, magnitudes not reached except for the 1930 to 45 period. Also, internal conflicts. Populism of the left and the right never happened in developed countries through my lifetime, and caused by the largest wealth and values differences, irreconcilable differences, perhaps, that could lead to a type of civil war, I'm not saying necessarily guns and shooting, but I am saying a type of civil war, and certainly is leading to great conflict and dysfunction in government, not just in the United States, but other places. And the third great influence, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, through a cycle, there's the rise, there's a war, dominant powers win the war. This was in 1945. Then the new rules of the game are established, particularly by the dominant power being able to establish them. And then there's a period of peace and prosperity. And then with time, other countries come along and become competitor, such as China has come along and become a competitor. So there are also two other factors that I found. I call these together the big five. The other factor, number 4, is acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have throughout history actually caused more deaths and toppled more orders than the first three that I mentioned. And then throughout history, great technology changes, big changes, such as the Industrial Revolutions. And of course, we are going through those types of changes with AI and other forms of technology changes that are having and will have revolutionary effects. So I call that, the big five. Before I get into the big five and share my thoughts, what I'd like to do is share with you a clip from the video I did called The Changing World Order. It's about a 40-minute video. What I want to show you is 4 minutes of that video to give you an idea of what the cycle looks like that repeats over time. And by the way, when I say a cycle, I don't mean anything's predestined to operate in a cycle, but there are cause-effect relationships like any cycle, and there are measures of health. And those measures can be seen and measured and anticipated to help to take a view of the future. So I want to show you the pattern that I've seen by studying the last 500 years of history, which is covered in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. So I'll take 4 minutes of your time to show you the animation. I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again. So that's a typical cycle, and you have to watch it and give whatever thought and credence to that you think is appropriate. But let me touch on the big five. By my calculations and understanding the mechanics of the creation of debt, the creation of debt for individuals or companies and governments is all the same except for one big difference, in which that is the government's ability to print money to pay debt. In other words, debt is an obligation to pay back money. And if that system works well, there's a reward. Interest rates are high enough to be good for the lender and who becomes the creditor. That lender-creditor can have a high enough interest rate that they get a good return from that lending, and that the borrower doesn't have such a high interest rate that is crushing for them financially. And the more debt rises relative to income, the more difficult that is. So the debts that have been accumulated, and large debts are projected, particularly in the United States, but this is now a world phenomenon. There's simply not enough money to go around, so for all the social programs, military, and other things, there is therefore the progression of debt continuing to rise relative to incomes, which is setting itself up for a challenge. Central banks, by buying the debt, have taken on their balance sheets. And so that is a risky situation which evolves over time. It's not the most immediate situation, but it'll certainly be affected by the other things that are going on. All of five of these, by the way, affect each other. So the interrelationship in creating that cycle is important. Okay, the second is the internal conflict. And of course, that is the highlight of this year. How will particularly the elections in the United States go? There are two questions related to that. Will the elections be accepted by both sides? And what are the consequences of that? We honestly don't know the answer. There are reasons for concern, and I'll leave that to you. But there are also very big differences between the policies of what would be a Trump administration and what would be a Democratic administration, particularly the issue of left-right. Both parties have moderates and have extremists, and in both cases, there will be likely conflict between the extremists. And so in the Trump presidency, you're getting much more of a nationalistic, isolationist, protectionist type of policies that are of the right and are likely to offer more protections to those who have larger amounts of money, the wealthy and the corporations. And of course, on the left, most of those policies are somewhat different. But the one thing that there's broad agreement on is the I would say, anti-China policies. So that brings us, so in 2024, we are going to learn a lot about these and what the policies will be. The third influence, of the great power conflict is something that you all see up close. And both countries, the United States and China, have their own sets of challenges. In China's case, there is of course, the real estate creating the debt issues and the economic issues coming from that. And as President Xi said, there's an approaching 1 in 100-year storm on the horizon. And there are domestic issues. Climate, of course, is a big issue, has always been for China. and there are those financial issues, and taking more of a top-down, more autocratic type of approach to consolidating power and operating from the top. And then, of course, in the United States, we have the internal conflict and the problems we just spoke about. And of course, that has enormous implications for the world. Because if you read history, you see that the economic warfare precedes military warfare. I can't comment. I have no particular inside information regarding military conflict. You all see the situation. I believe it's most likely that there's not an imminent form of military conflict, but we do have a situation, of course, with Taiwan, that there is a one China policy, and that will not go on forever. And so that has created a set of circumstances now in which there are questions. There are questions from international investors about whether they will experience consequences that could come from their governments. For example, American investors investing in China could experience from their government negative consequences for that. And then there's also the worry from that the Chinese side could make that challenging. And then there's the raising of issues, of the ideological issues. Let's say, is in China, is it still glorious to be rich? Is it what does the continuation of market economy, how is that going to work, and how does property protections work, and how are the issues about common prosperity, what does that all what does that all look like? And so that's an evolutionary set of circumstances which you're exposed to, and creates risks and issues and even capital flows that change the world landscape. For example, Chinese producers producing outside of China, and not only in the ASEAN countries like Vietnam and the like, but also in countries like Mexico. And how does that all work? That's changing the landscape. And of course, there's a great risk of economic sanctions, an exchange of economic sanctions that would be really terrible for the world. So there's risks behind that. At the same time, Chinese assets are very attractively priced, and we've done very well. Bridgewater has done very well over the last 5 years of operating in there, and so there's certainly effective ways to make investments in China. And then we come to the fourth influence, which is the climate issue. And there's particularly climate, droughts, floods, and pandemics, which have been incredibly deterministic and influential in China. So at a minimum, this is going to be very financially costly in one way or another, either to try to keep climate temperature levels rising to 1.5 degrees and inventing new technologies, or paying for the damages that occur from it, or building infrastructure to protect oneself around that, seawalls and other things. It costs about, estimated cost, $8 trillion a year. That $8 trillion a year worldwide is equivalent to about 8% of world GDP. It's certainly going to be a disruptor, and it'll change migration patterns, and it'll have big, big effects. And of course, number 5, as I said, was technology. And in my opinion, we are going right now through the greatest industrial revolution changes. You know, and when I look at history, and I think the power of the printing press in being able to have knowledge pass, and when knowledge could be built on and shared, what an incredible invention. And then, of course, we went from the agricultural age to the industrial age, in which man learned that machines could replace people doing a lot of different things. And that created, of course, a great economic boom. And of course, we have had the digital revolution that's gone on, that's included all that, you know, all its various ways that you're well acquainted with. And of course, this technology revolution, AI, when you start to thinking touches everything, and the capacity to either supplement one's thinking or to do work that could have been less effectively done at more costs by people, and the productivity impact, but also technology. It could be used for war. It's a fabulous tool, and we're entering an era that we really can't fully anticipate. So those five forces are interdependent on each other and will influence. But it's a period that we're entering into of greater risk. And the main thing I would emphasize is the need for effective diversification. So if I was to leave you with some messages, the messages would be that the power of diversification is greater than the power of even good decision making, because you can improve your return to risk ratio by a factor of 5 if you can find good uncorrelated return streams. And when we think about diversification, diversification means diversification of countries, diversification of asset classes, diversification of currencies, and so broader diversification. I can't take the time to take you through really the structural ways of being able to diversify well, but I would also emphasize some big picture tactical considerations. Basically, there are 3 things that I look for in countries. And I suppose to some extent I look for it also in corporations, countries, and people in terms of managing their finances. And so here they are. First, does the country as a whole earn more than it spends? So does it have a good income statement and a balance sheet so that it has the financial capabilities of dealing with the issues at hand? The second is it an environment that is conducive for healthy competition and working together to create great productivity through great leadership and great productivity? And number 3, is it a country that is at risk of a war, to being caught between countries in a war? You know, I studied markets behavior in wars, and there are 3 types of countries. Those countries that are the winners, those that are the losers in the war, and those that are neutral in the war. And it turns out that those that are neutral in the war do better than the winners of the war, who still pay a terrible cost, financially as well as in loss of life and destruction. And then, of course, the worst is the losers of the war, who lose everything. My main point is that in thinking about what is the financial health of a country, how well do they work together to be productive together, and are they at risk of a conflict that would be disruptive to all of that? So that's what I look at when I'm thinking about diversification. I think about diversification of asset classes. And I would say a couple of things. I am worried about debt assets being able to provide an adequate return. There has been a big monetization of debt, so now central banks own a lot of those debts. They have losses on those debts. If things continue, then they will have to monetize even their losses. And that's a classic late cycle inflationary consequence. In addition, one man's debts are another man's assets. Right now, there's a need for about a 2% real return. That's a good guideline of an indifference point. 2% real return is required in order to have an equilibrium. And so watch that real return to see is if it's maintained, and if that could be maintained without the debt squeeze happening. So for those reasons, I don't like debt assets. I like equity assets. I think that gold should be part of the portfolio. Gold is an alternative money. In fact, it is the third largest reserve currency after the dollar and the euro and ahead of the yen. So I would diversify and pay attention to those. Those are my general thoughts. Those factors will be drivers. And I think that the important thing, most again to repeat, is to diversify well in good environments that are suitable for productivity, which are many of the neutral states. For example, the ASEAN countries, India, even the Gulf countries, which there's the Middle Eastern war, but for many reasons, there's reasons to believe that they're not likely to get involved, but everything is an uncertainty. And there's productivity there. So thinking about the geographic, of course, you will continue to invest in the United States. When I think about diversification, also of new technologies, which I think are going to be revolutionary in their impact, there is only the United States and China in terms of the big players in this. So I think that diversification and investing in China is a desirable amount, is a desirable investment. But like some of the other measures that investments I'm referring to, like gold and the like, I think you have to pay attention to the quantities that you have in each one of those locations to spread them out. So again, maybe that's 10% in each one of those and picking fairly uncorrelated investments. So that's it in a nutshell. Again, sorry I couldn't be with you and take your direct questions, but anyway, I'm sure you'll have a great conference because they always put on a great conference. All the best.